Hello, my name is Nicholas Payne. I'm going to be talking to you today about Glenn Greenwald's book, No Place to Hide, Edward Snowden, the NSA, and the U.S. Surveillance. And this is a really important book where Glenn Greenwald uncovered the truth about what the NSA was doing, all because of Edward Snowden, who released and leaked these documents and did so through Glenn Greenwald. The first chapter in this book covers a lot of the background and foreknowledge needed to know before diving into the details of this book. So it starts out explaining why Glenn Greenwald was the man for this project, why Edward Snowden chose him to kind of publish and reveal a lot of the important information. Glenn Greenwald wrote a book and unveiled a big story about George W. Bush and him authorizing the NSA to eavesdrop on American citizens without a warrant. And Greenwald goes on to explain how it's kind of in the context of the Fourth Amendment, and which says that the government cannot unlawfully search and seize any information or any objects that are tangible. And Greenwald goes on to argue that that applies to electronic information as well. And he kind of goes on in the rest of this chapter to explain a lot of the history and context that leads up to what happened in Edward Snowden's case. So in the second chapter, it really gets into the story of how they first met. So Greenwald explains how he got to Hong Kong and all the secrecy and kind of like secret agent feeling stuff that he had to do to get there. And when he finally did get to sit down with him in a hotel in Hong Kong, he describes how skeptical he was, his thoughts, his reactions to sitting there for the first time. And it goes into how he finally was convinced, and he starts to tell Snowden's story, kind of his life story and his background, really trying to understand how patriotic he was. And then they go into the media. How and where should they release all this information? Where should they go? What platform should they use? And then they start talking about how the story is unfolding, and how Snowden really wants to reveal himself intentionally. He wants to put himself out there versus them finding him. So the third chapter goes into more of the details on how it all works and the ideals and intentions of the NSA. Their motto really was to collect it all, which also is the chapter of the title. He explains how the goal of the NSA is total global surveillance. Total surveillance. He explains who's involved, the various groups. So it includes the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia. They all make up a coalition called the FVEY, and they all share information and help spy stuff. And so a lot of the information is shared with them, but the U.S. also refuses to share some information, keeping it solely to themselves. The chapter also goes into there's domestic and foreign targets. Domestically, we're all tracked and they also look at foreign people. They do this through content and metadata. Those are two big keys that they talk about there. And Keith B. Alexander plays a role in this chapter. He was the four-star general who really led the NSA and pushed them to the boundaries, sometimes to and beyond the legal line of what's acceptable. And he and the NSA did this through various programs that are explained in the chapter, like PRISM, Blarney, Fairview, and his final point that he makes in this chapter is that there's little to no oversight at all. They kind of operate without a leash and free to do what they want to a certain extent. So the fourth chapter is about the harm of the surveillance state. And here Greenwald really tries to make his point on the importance of privacy. So he starts by kind of, talking about the internet giants. He uses a lot of quotes from rabbis and Michael Foucault. He also explains how this has all happened before. He points to 1984 when there was government surveillance. However, at the time, they considered it too far and they had to back off. But even then, they didn't have the kind of technology that they do today. So there was not the same amount of reach. The surveillance was not the same. He also goes into how other groups are being treated, like Anonymous and WikiLeaks, and how the real goal of all of this surveillance is to create passivity, obedience, conformity within the society. So we as people being surveilled are supposed to, start to conform to really what the government wants. And he challenges that, saying we don't owe that to the government. We should really act as we should act. And Snowden holds a similar viewpoint. And then he talks about how the government needs to be a balance of power, and it needs to be restricted. And finally, that the politics are also messed up around this. It is not Republican, it is not Democrat, it is kind of whoever benefits the most to say or use this surveillance. So the fifth chapter, the final one, is called the Fourth Estate, which Greenwald calls the political media, and he really feels, as a political journalist, feels that it holds a very highly important role in the society. He goes on to explain that it really acts as a check and a balance to the government. It is the investigative journalism that calls out the government when there's overreach, when they've gone too far, and it plays a really important role as a check and balance. He, in the process of leaking this information, was attacked, and by other, not physically, he was called out by a lot of other journalists. And he goes on to explain that the corporate media today kind of panders to the government and furthers their agenda rather than challenging it and exposing it. And so what he really is trying to say is that the media today is kind of a puppet to the government, and he is cast as an outsider for challenging that. So he spends a lot of the chapter trying to defend himself, and so he talks about the role that they have and talking about how the media really struggled to get a grasp of what this situation was. So they spent a good amount of time trying to characterize Snowden, and falsely. No one had met him. Snowden had refused to meet with any of them. So a lot of it was trying to spin this thing into a more demonic, evil plot. So I think that there is a strong thesis in the book. It really speaks to our rights as citizens. How much of a balance do we need between government looking out for terrorists, and what do we have as just a right to be ourselves and not monitored constantly? I think that both Snowden and Greenwald uh, felt that the government was overreaching too far and really overstepping its limits and encroaching on our civil liberties. Um, and I think it was really the goal of this book was to kind of portray that and say we need to have a conversation about where the line is. Where is the line that says the government should be on the watch for terrorists, should protect us? That's its job, but also should we be monitored constantly? Should I be fearful that the government is getting this video now? And I think that's really what they were trying to drive at, and the justification and the true role of the people, the media, and its relationship to the government. What I personally really liked about the book was how Greenwald really told the story of how it all unraveled. I think it is really important to know how he first felt sitting with Snowden, the troubles that he had to go to, the paranoia that came into unleashing this. It really sounded a lot like a movie or a a Jason Bourne kind of thing. It was cool in kind of painting the picture. At the same time, I think, especially in the last chapter, in chapter 5, he really focused in on himself a lot, and he did so to make a point, certainly, about the role of a journalist uncovering something of that nature. And he did point to other journalists who did similar things. I think he really used that chapter to defend himself, which absolutely, he should. It sound like, based on his book, that he was painted in a bad light and taken out of context a lot. So, if he chose this as his platform to do so, I suppose that's hard to argue with. But, it was informing. I think he really did cover all the bases, and it was a good book.